Chapter 1. How early Maori navigators read stars through coconut fiber grids. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different, a gentle drift across the Pacific Ocean, because why not start with some stars and coconuts before bedtime? So dim the lights, settle into your comfiest chair or bed, and let's float over to Aotearoa, the land that would later be called New Zealand. Imagine the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, nothing but water and sky, and a small, finely woven piece of coconut fiber in the hands of someone who, honestly, probably didn't get much sleep either, but in a calm, focused, navigational kind of way. These coconut fiber grids, called maramataka in some contexts and roru in others, were more than just bits of string and knots. They were sophisticated star maps, mental and physical guides that connected the dots between the heavens and the vast, blue nothingness of the Pacific. Early Maori navigators, or tohunga o te moana, would lay these grids out at night, sometimes on sand, sometimes on flat mats, and trace the positions of stars as if they were drawing invisible lines across the sky. And yes, before you ask, this was long before telescopes or smartphones, because why not learn everything from scratch in the dark with nothing but the sky above? The grids themselves were fairly simple to look at, though incredibly complex to actually use. You had these horizontal and vertical fibers, tied carefully with knots that indicated specific stars, star clusters, and even phases of the moon. Each knot was a tiny anchor, holding a piece of astronomical knowledge in place, almost like a tiny, permanent reminder that the ocean doesn't really care about your schedule. And the thing is, the early navigators didn't just memorize these things. They internalized them. They could sense the ocean's currents and winds in relation to the stars, almost like the sky was whispering directions directly into their brains. And of course, not everyone could do this. It was considered a serious skill, reserved for a few select individuals who had years of observation under their belts. Young apprentices would watch their elders, sometimes for decades, gradually learning to see the ocean and sky as one continuous map. Imagine spending your teenage years lying on your back in the sand, staring at stars, probably wondering when dinner would come or if you were going to ever get a break from this celestial homework. One of the neat things about these grids is that they were inherently flexible. Unlike European maps that tried to fix everything to scale on paper, the coconut fiber grids could be adapted for different seasons and voyages. A star that was useful for navigating in summer might have a completely different position in winter, and the navigators knew all these variations by heart. It's almost funny to think of someone sitting there, untangling a bit of coconut fiber and thinking, ah yes, Rigel is slightly too low tonight, better adjust the knot. Because of course, precision mattered, but not in a frantic, stressful way, more in a gentle, consistent, long-term attention to detail way. Let's float over to the actual voyages themselves. When early Maori set out across the Pacific in their waka, which were these large, sturdy canoes often equipped with outriggers for stability, the stars weren't just decoration. They were vital. A slight miscalculation could mean drifting aimlessly for days, which, while not immediately dangerous if you had food and fresh water, was still inconvenient and stressful in a way that modern humans can only half imagine. The navigators would use the coconut fiber grids to plan routes, identify resting points on small islands, and even estimate travel times based on wind patterns. And yes, they did all this without Google Maps or weather apps. Because why make it easy when you can spend years mastering celestial geometry instead? The grids themselves also carried cultural significance. Each knot, each fiber placement, was tied to stories, genealogies, and historical voyages. Some knots represented ancestors who had successfully crossed vast distances, almost like a gentle nod to those who came before. Others were tied to cautionary tales, reminding the navigator of storms, tricky currents, or islands that were less hospitable than they appeared on the horizon. So every time a navigator adjusted a fiber or traced a knot with a finger, they weren't just checking a star. They were connecting with generations of knowledge, experience, and, well, mild existential dread about the open ocean. Interestingly, some of these grids weren't permanent. They were designed to be temporary, laid out at night and then carefully rolled or bundled away by morning. That way, a navigational plan could change depending on conditions. If the wind shifted or a current ran stronger than expected, the navigator could adjust the knots or fibers without feeling guilty about ruining an expensive or sacred map. It's almost like a Pacific Ocean version of a dry erase board, but much more elegant, and probably with fewer markers rolling into the water. Another point to consider is that these systems weren't just about survival, they were about thriving. By understanding the stars and the seas, early Maori could establish trade routes, discover new islands, and transport people and goods across vast distances with a level of confidence that must have been deeply satisfying. Imagine the pride of pointing to a coconut fiber grid and saying, in effect, "Yes, I know exactly where the next island is, and yes, I also know it has coconuts, bananas, and maybe a few pesky crabs waiting for us." The art of navigation was deeply social too. Voyages were communal efforts, and the navigator held a special place in that hierarchy. Everyone on the waka respected and sometimes feared this knowledge. A misread star or a mistide knot might be forgiven eventually, but not before a long, quiet judgment from the rest of the crew. And the navigator themselves had to remain calm, almost unnervingly calm, because the ocean doesn't respond to panic. It's patient, unchanging, and just slightly indifferent, perfect for putting you to sleep if you think about it long enough. Now, let's drift to the learning process again. Apprentices didn't just study knots and fibers. They studied the sky itself. They memorized the rising and setting points of key stars, the phases of the moon, and the predictable movements of planets. Some navigators even paid attention to seabirds and their flight patterns, reading the natural world like an extension of the coconut fiber grids. It's tempting to think of these navigators as ancient astronomers, but it's more accurate to think of them as holistic ocean whisperers, blending practical skill with observational artistry. In some ways, the coconut fiber grids are reminiscent of early scientific notebooks, though far less linear. Where a European scholar might jot a careful equation or sketch a rigid diagram, the Maori navigators created dynamic, tactile systems that could be physically manipulated, adjusted, and interacted with. A finger could trace a knot, a twist could indicate a subtle seasonal shift, and the entire grid became a living map, something that moved and changed with the ocean and sky rather than sitting quietly on a desk collecting dust. Of course, one of the quieter tragedies in this story is how much knowledge was, and is, at risk of being lost. These systems relied on oral tradition and careful apprenticeship. If a navigator didn't teach an apprentice, or if a community was displaced, knots could be forgotten, and centuries of insight could vanish almost overnight. But somehow, much of this knowledge has survived, carefully preserved in stories, chants, and yes, even reconstructed coconut fiber grids used today to teach modern navigators. It's oddly comforting to think that despite centuries of change, the stars remain the same, and someone somewhere is still tracing knots in the sand, connecting with the same constellations as their ancestors did. And speaking of constellations, it's worth noting that the Maori didn't see the sky the same way we do in a planetarium. Their stars had stories, personalities, and sometimes temperaments. Some stars were known for being helpful, steady guides. Others were tricksters, prone to shifting just enough to throw off an unobservant navigator. It's a reminder that science and mythology weren't separate, they were entwined, much like the coconut fibers themselves. You couldn't have one without the other, and trying to separate them would probably lead you straight into the ocean. The more you think about it, the more remarkable it becomes. Coconut fibers, knots, and a sky full of stars enabled human beings to cross thousands of miles of open water with minimal risk, long before engines, metal hulls, or satellite GPS. And the elegance of it all is that it was never flashy. No one was trying to impress anyone with a big display or loud announcement. The system worked quietly, calmly, and beautifully. And as we drift through this story tonight, you might even find it oddly soothing to imagine the gentle, rhythmic motions of the ocean, the soft crunch of sand under a kneeling apprentice, and the faint, constant light of distant stars guiding a tiny canoe across an immense, indifferent sea. By now, you might be feeling a little drowsy just thinking about it, which is perfect. That's exactly the pace of these narratives, soft, detailed, and endless enough to lull the mind into a gentle, reflective calm. We'll linger on these images a bit longer, the knots, the grids, the quiet focus of someone tracing the positions of Rigel, Sirius, and Betelgeuse across a dark, unbroken sky. The patience required is almost meditative, a quiet rhythm of observation and adjustment that mirrors the slow pulse of the ocean itself. And with that, we've covered the basics of how early Maori navigators used coconut fiber grids to read the stars. They were patient, careful, and deeply connected to both the cosmos and the ocean, a combination that produced not only effective voyagers but also a subtle, almost poetic way of engaging with the world. So as you settle further into your chair or bed, imagine tracing those fibers with your own fingers, feeling the knots, letting the stars guide you across an endless Pacific expanse, and knowing that centuries of quiet, careful observation made this all possible. Chapter 2: Voyages, Mistakes, and the Quirky Lives of Navigators. Not every voyage across the Pacific was a triumph. Some were quiet disasters, though nothing that involved shouting or high drama, more like prolonged, mildly inconvenient mistakes that probably made everyone a bit grumpy and extra aware of the stars. One of the more famous examples involves a navigator named Hemi, who spent years learning the ropes, memorizing the knots, and perfecting his coconut fiber grids. Hemi was methodical, calm, and apparently deeply committed to making his boatmates mildly impressed rather than terrified. Hemi once attempted a voyage to an island that wasn't exactly where he expected it to be. The stars aligned in ways he hadn't accounted for, because, let's face it, even stars can be tricky when you're trying to interpret them through a knot and fiber system. By the time they realized the miscalculation, they were slightly north of the intended island, which wasn't a catastrophe, but it did result in a week-long detour filled with quiet muttering, extra paddling, and some very precise recalculations. Hemi didn't freak out. He just squatted on deck, tracing his fingers along the fibers of his grid, murmuring to himself in a monotone that probably sounded like, yes, Rigel is slightly off, correctable. This incident is fairly typical. Early Maori navigators were not dramatists. They didn't punch the air or engage in theatrical curses at the sky. If a knot was misplaced or a star slightly off, they fixed it methodically and quietly. The rest of the crew mostly watched and tried not to interfere. It's likely they were also mildly sleep-deprived, having spent hours on watch while scanning the horizon and mentally comparing it to the coconut fiber map. What's interesting about these navigators is how deeply personal the craft could be. Hemi, for instance, had a superstition that tracing the same knot 3 times before dawn would ensure fair winds. It may sound silly, but these little rituals were repeated with calm dedication, almost like a nightly stretching routine for the soul. And yes, some navigators had more eccentric habits. One recorded case mentions a navigator who would hum softly to himself in tune with the stars, claiming that the vibrations helped him feel the ocean's mood. His crew indulged him quietly, partly because it seemed harmless and partly because it didn't affect anyone's paddling rhythm. Then there were the apprentices. They learned through long, slow observation, often sleeping on mats near the canoe's hull while their master traced knots and murmured star positions. These apprentices quickly discovered that being patient was more than a virtue. It was the only way to survive months at sea without losing your mind. One apprentice, a young woman named Ringi, was noted for her uncanny memory of star positions. She could recall the exact knot pattern for a particular season after only a handful of nights observing her master. Naturally, she was considered both gifted and slightly intimidating to her peers, who muttered about how she probably dreamed in coconut fiber knots. Voyages weren't just about stars, though. Ocean currents, wind patterns, and even bird migrations played quiet but crucial roles. Certain seabirds, for example, only ventured a few dozen miles from land, so spotting one in the distance could quietly indicate the presence of an island. It wasn't the kind of revelation that led to loud exclamations. Instead, the navigator might calmly adjust a knot or shift a fiber, nodding at the apprentice in a manner that said, "Yes, we are on the right path." The birds themselves seemed unaware of the significance, happily circling or diving for fish, entirely indifferent to centuries of human observation. And yet, despite the calm, almost meditative nature of the work, mistakes happened. Occasionally, a navigator would misread the moon's phase or misjudge the star's altitude, leading to tiny miscalculations that stretched voyages by days. One such story involves a voyage intended for an island with plentiful taro and sweet potatoes. The navigator misinterpreted the rising of a key star, and they ended up near an island with lots of rocks and very little food. The crew survived, naturally. They were skilled and well prepared, but the misalignment of knots and stars meant they spent several nights paddling in circles, grumbling quietly to themselves, and probably contemplating the existential futility of being at sea. Interestingly, some navigators had very particular preferences for how knots were tied. One master refused to use fibers that weren't sourced from the finest, youngest coconuts, claiming that older fibers did not speak to the stars properly. This kind of fastidiousness seems trivial, but in practice, it could slightly improve the accuracy of the grid, if only because the knots held more consistently. Apprentices had to endure these demands silently, occasionally muttering about the minor absurdity of treating coconut fibers like sacred instruments, which, in a way, they were. Voyages could also reveal the personal quirks and minor tragedies of these navigators. Some were prone to seasickness, a condition not usually fatal but inconvenient enough to be quietly remarked upon in logs or oral history. One navigator reportedly spent half of a 2-week voyage lying flat in the bow, murmuring to himself, "Stars are still correct. Mostly, please let me keep my lunch down." His crew adapted, steering slightly to minimize rolling and nodding politely at his observations when he could muster them. The social hierarchy on these voyages was subtle but strict. The navigator had ultimate authority over directional decisions, though rarely exercised it loudly. Their word was final, but it was always delivered in a calm, monotone way that kept tempers low and eyes drooping. The crew's role was more physical, involving paddling, maintaining the canoe, and observing minor environmental cues. Yet even among navigators, personality differences emerged. Some were introverted and precise, spending hours adjusting knots quietly. Others were slightly more talkative, explaining the rationale behind each fiber placement in long, unhurried sentences that could easily lull listeners into drowsiness. One fascinating aspect of these voyages was the integration of memory and physical skill. The knots in the coconut fiber grids weren't just visual aids, they were tactile. Navigators would run fingers over the knots, feeling subtle differences in spacing and tension, translating these sensations into precise knowledge about star positions. It's almost like the grid itself had a texture of the sky, a soft, woven reminder of the heavens that could be read by touch as well as sight. Then there are the stories of intergenerational knowledge. Some navigators traced patterns first created by their grandparents, who had in turn learned them from parents and grandparents before them. Occasionally, a master would add a minor innovation, perhaps a slightly different knotting technique or an adjustment for a local current, but these changes were subtle, barely noticeable to outsiders. Apprentices often describe the experience as being part of a conversation that spans centuries, conducted in knots, fibers, and quiet observations. Even small islands had stories. A navigational stop wasn't just a waypoint, it was a narrative point, a chance to interact with local flora and fauna, sometimes meet distant kin, and quietly reaffirm the connection between human effort and environmental knowledge. Some islands had minor quirks, reefs that made landing tricky, birds that were unusually aggressive, or plants that were deceptively slippery. Navigators noted these details in passing, but only ever in the calmest tone imaginable, as if the ocean and the stars were judging the triviality of human concerns. Apprentices, again, played a critical role. They were often the ones who kept track of food stores, observed the sky while the navigator rested, or prepared mats for overnight observation. Their learning was gradual, with emphasis on patience, observation, and repetition. One young apprentice, whose name has been preserved in a few oral histories as Tane, reportedly spent months memorizing just one section of a grid. He became so proficient that he could correct minor mistakes without disturbing the navigator. This earned him quiet respect and slightly envious glances from peers, though no one ever said it out loud because, of course, no one wanted to break the calm monotony of the voyage. Sometimes, navigators would experience minor personal crises during voyages. One anecdote involves a master navigator who discovered, mid-journey, that he had miscalculated a seasonal star's position. Instead of panicking, he reportedly sat for hours, tracing knots, murmuring quietly to himself, and occasionally sighing deeply. His crew respected the silence, watching the slow, meticulous process unfold. Eventually, the course was corrected, and the voyage continued with minimal disruption. The story has been preserved, perhaps more as an illustration of calm persistence than any actual drama. It's also worth noting that the navigators often had oddly mundane personal habits. Some preferred specific mats for lying down during the day. Others would hum or whisper poetry quietly to themselves, sometimes in sync with star positions. Some had particular preferences for the placement of paddles or small tools, claiming that an out-of-place implement could disrupt the harmony of the grid. These minor quirks didn't affect the success of the voyage, usually, but they added a quiet richness to the mental picture of daily life at sea. And then there were the quiet, almost poetic moments when the navigators would pause and simply observe. A night with the moon reflecting off calm waters, a gentle wind brushing the surface, stars perfectly aligned with knots in the coconut fiber grid. These moments weren't dramatic in any conventional sense. There were no fireworks, no cheering. Just the slow, unremarkable perfection of someone doing exactly what they had trained to do, and the world behaving in a way that made their meticulous preparation worthwhile. These voyages, repeated over years and sometimes generations, became a blend of practical navigation, cultural storytelling, and personal habit. The coconut fiber grids weren't just tools, they were extensions of the navigator's mind, hand, and even personality. A slight tension in a fiber, a particular way of tying a knot, or a minor innovation in reading the stars could subtly reflect the individual navigator's style. In this sense, the grids were both scientific instruments and intimate self-expression, quietly interwoven with centuries of tradition and personal idiosyncrasy. Chapter 3: Seasonal Stars, Currents, and Quiet Navigational Disasters. Navigating the Pacific wasn't just about knowing which stars were up tonight. It was about knowing how the stars changed across months and seasons, and how the ocean responded to those changes. A navigator had to think in rhythms: lunar cycles, tidal shifts, wind patterns, and the subtle migrations of seabirds. All of these things were interwoven with the knots in the coconut fiber grids, like a giant, tactile calendar that could gently guide a canoe hundreds of miles without drama or fanfare. Seasonal variations were especially critical. Certain stars only rose at particular times of year, and these stars indicated not just direction but timing. For instance, a star might mark the optimal departure for a voyage to a specific island because it coincided with the prevailing winds. Leaving a week early or late could mean struggling against unfavorable currents or getting caught in a period of persistent squalls. Navigators treated these calendars with quiet reverence, often muttering under their breath about how this star is being particularly uncooperative, or, of course it had to rise late tonight. These were not complaints in the modern sense, just calm observations of inconvenient cosmic behavior. Currents, too, had personalities. Some were steady and predictable, gently nudging the canoe along. Others were fickle, shifting with temperature or seasonal rains. Experienced navigators could read a current by the slight movement of water against the hull, the way waves lapped at the outriggers, or even the subtle drift of floating debris. One particularly meticulous navigator reportedly spent 2 nights lying on his stomach at the bow, tracing a coconut fiber grid while occasionally dipping a hand into the water to feel the direction and speed of the current. His crew quietly watched him, resigned to the fact that this was both necessary and mildly exhausting for everyone involved. And then there were the minor disasters that never made it into heroic tales but were deeply instructive. A navigator might misread a knot or slightly miscalculate a star's altitude, resulting in a drift that added several extra days to a voyage. The crew didn't panic. They paddled, adjusted the grid, and sometimes spent hours silently recalculating. One recorded voyage involved a slight seasonal misalignment that caused a canoe to overshoot an island by just a few miles. The navigator didn't panic. He simply muttered about a lazy star and adjusted the knots accordingly. The crew, after a day of extra paddling, mostly grumbled quietly, secretly impressed by the calm efficiency of it all. Personal quirks of navigators often influenced these small incidents. Some had very particular ways of tying knots, claiming that a certain twist or tension spoke to the stars. Others preferred certain fibers over others, asserting that a rougher or older fiber could introduce minor errors. Apprentices sometimes rolled their eyes, but mostly kept silent, because the system worked and the ocean was not impressed by skepticism. Birds were another quiet variable. Certain species indicated proximity to land, while others could warn of changing weather. A navigator might spot a particular seabird flying in a specific pattern and quietly adjust a fiber knot, noting that the island lay just beyond the horizon. These observations were subtle, almost poetic in their execution. Birds didn't make announcements, stars didn't cheer, and currents didn't apologize. Everything worked in calm, persistent silence. Some navigators had unusual rituals for reinforcing their knowledge. One, who apparently took his craft very seriously, would hum a slow, deliberate tune while tracing knots at night. He claimed it helped him sync with the stars. The crew indulged him quietly, nodding occasionally, partly out of respect and partly because it didn't disturb anyone. Another navigator would trace each knot 3 times before committing to a course adjustment, muttering under his breath about precision. These habits were gentle eccentricities, woven seamlessly into the daily rhythms of long voyages. Long-term memory was critical. A navigator could not rely on the grid alone. He needed to internalize star positions, seasonal shifts, and subtle environmental cues. One master navigator reportedly memorized the rising and setting points of over 50 individual stars, each tied to specific islands, currents, and months of the year. This allowed him to make subtle corrections mid-voyage without touching the physical grid at all. Apprentices watched quietly, gradually learning to integrate observation, intuition, and tactile memory into one cohesive system. Even small errors were educational. When a navigator misread a star or overestimated a current, the consequences were rarely dramatic but always instructive. The crew might paddle extra hours, adjust knots, or recalculate positions, all while maintaining calm monotony. These minor errors reinforced the value of careful observation and patience, and ensured that the apprentice was never bored, which is apparently the 18th century equivalent of modern sleep training. Voyages were also opportunities for personal reflection. Many navigators reported a meditative quality to long periods at sea. Tracing knots, observing stars, and feeling the rhythm of the waves became a gentle practice of patience and awareness. Even minor frustrations, like a slightly crooked fiber or a star that rose late, were absorbed into this larger calm. A voyage could last weeks, sometimes months, and yet the navigators rarely exhibited urgency. They simply existed in rhythm with the ocean and sky, quietly adjusting and observing as necessary. Cultural stories were embedded in these journeys. Certain knots or fibers were associated with ancestors or mythic events, gently reminding navigators of their place in a lineage of knowledge. One navigator traced a fiber while softly reciting a chant about a successful crossing made by his great-grandparent, silently acknowledging that the current voyage was part of a larger, ongoing pattern. These moments weren't dramatic. They were quiet, reflective, and soothing, reinforcing the continuity between generations. The canoe itself was part of this narrative. Some were sleek and fast, others more sturdy but less agile. Navigators adapted their grids to match the canoe's characteristics. A faster canoe might require slightly different knot spacing to account for speed, while a heavier canoe demanded adjustments to accommodate drift. These modifications were subtle, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, but essential for maintaining accuracy over long distances. Weather, naturally, added another layer of gentle complication. Winds could be favorable or stubbornly opposed. Navigators noted these variations and adjusted knots, sometimes predicting shifts days in advance based on lunar cycles or subtle changes in wave patterns. One story mentions a navigator calmly observing a sudden drop in wind and quietly adjusting a fiber, noting that the moon is sulking tonight. The crew nodded politely, silently acknowledging the inevitability of cosmic mood swings. Minor superstitions also persisted. Some navigators believed that tracing a particular knot at dawn ensured fair winds. Others claimed that humming in sync with a star's rising promoted stability. These practices were not treated as desperate magic. They were gentle rituals, quietly integrated into daily routines, much like stretching before bed or brewing a calming tea. The social hierarchy aboard a waka was subtle but consistent. The navigator had authority over direction and star interpretation. Crew members had responsibilities like paddling, monitoring supplies, and assisting with minor adjustments. Apprentices were learners and observers, quietly absorbing knowledge while performing practical tasks. Each person contributed to the rhythm of the voyage, and the collective calm made extended travel tolerable, even soothing. And then there were those moments when the universe reminded navigators that, despite centuries of accumulated knowledge, it remained indifferent. Unexpected currents, faintly misaligned stars, or an elusive island could introduce minor inconveniences that stretched a voyage by days. But these were never dramatic crises, just gentle nudges from the cosmos, reminders that patience and careful observation were more important than haste or anxiety. Even mundane interactions on board were steeped in ritualized calm. Crew members passed food and water in quiet sequences. Tools were placed carefully and returned to their assigned spots. Mats for resting were arranged in precise, functional patterns. Nothing was chaotic. Even small mistakes, like spilling a bit of water or misplacing a paddle, were handled with quiet adjustment, a minor sigh, and gentle correction. Over time, apprentices internalized not just the technical skills but the temperament of successful navigation. Calm, patient, observant, and gently quirky, these traits were cultivated as much as the ability to trace knots or read stars. By the end of an apprenticeship, a young navigator could anticipate minor shifts in stars, winds, and currents before they happened, quietly adjusting the coconut fiber grid and murmuring to themselves in a tone so calm it could almost lull the rest of the crew to sleep. It's worth noting that these voyages, despite their occasional minor mishaps, were remarkably successful. Knowledge of the stars, currents, and winds allowed early Maori to travel vast distances, establish trade networks, and maintain connections across dispersed islands. The combination of tactile grids, memorized knowledge, and gentle observation created a system that was both precise and adaptable, a system that didn't need loud alarms or dramatic heroics to function. Even small islands had peculiarities that required careful attention. Certain beaches were particularly shallow, reefs were deceptively extensive, and some islands had freshwater that tasted slightly salty, confusing first-time visitors. Navigators noted these details quietly, often marking them with subtle adjustments in the fiber grid or a gentle oral admonition to apprentices. These minor observations accumulated over years and decades, forming a rich, almost imperceptible body of knowledge that ensured survival and efficiency without requiring overt drama or urgency. Chapter 4: Apprentices, Stars, and Legendary Voyages. Apprenticeships were long, slow, and, by most accounts, mildly exhausting. Young navigators spent months, sometimes years, absorbing the subtle art of reading the sky and tracing knots in coconut fiber grids. There were no formal schools, no certificates, and certainly no applause. Success was measured quietly, often by the navigator's ability to anticipate a star's rising point or the gentle drift of a current, and by the apprentice's capacity to absorb corrections without sighing too loudly. One young apprentice, Tama, was noted for an unusual combination of patience and stubbornness. He would lie on his mat for hours, tracing the knots repeatedly, muttering about which fibers felt correct, as if the ocean could sense hesitation. His master, a slightly eccentric but brilliant navigator named Manaya, observed Tama's progress with quiet amusement. Manaya had a habit of humming softly while adjusting the grids, claiming that it aligned the fibers with the star's vibrations. Tama eventually adopted the same habit, though he later admitted that it was mostly because it made him feel like he was doing something rather than nothing. Another apprentice, Hina, displayed a peculiar aptitude for subtle variations in knot tension. While others tied knots uniformly, she would adjust slightly for fiber thickness and texture, producing a grid that, according to her master, sang in a way the ocean understood. Hina's quiet innovations went unnoticed by most of the crew, but they made minor differences in course corrections during longer voyages. It's easy to imagine the ocean itself shrugging in approval. Some apprentices had more dramatic learning curves. One young man spent his first voyage repeatedly misaligning knots, misreading stars, and quietly muttering about the difficulty of predicting a moon that seemed determined to ignore him. By the end of the journey, however, he had memorized key constellations and could trace the fibers with his eyes closed. This transformation wasn't celebrated with fanfare. Instead, there was a calm acknowledgement, a nod, a quiet correction, a subtle adjustment in technique, and a slow, steady continuation of the voyage. The stars themselves had personalities in the eyes of the navigators. Some were steadfast and reliable, rising and setting at predictable times. Others were considered fickle, prone to slight shifts or misleading angles. A navigator might pause, tracing knots thoughtfully, and murmur, "Ah yes, Capella is in a sulky mood tonight." Crew members did not laugh, and there were no dramatic gestures. It was simply an observation, a recognition that even celestial bodies could be temperamental. Apprentices also learned to read signs beyond the stars. Ocean swells, wind shifts, and the flight patterns of seabirds all became part of the silent conversation with the environment. A flock of terns might indicate nearby land. A subtle change in wave height could suggest a current moving slightly faster than anticipated. Each observation was absorbed gently, integrated with knowledge from the coconut fiber grids, and quietly applied to maintain the course. Occasionally, legendary voyages are noted in oral history. One such journey involved a navigator who crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean with nothing but a small canoe, a set of coconut fiber grids, and a crew that had learned patience through long hours of observation. The journey wasn't dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no storms threatening to capsize the canoe, no heroic rescues. Instead, the story emphasizes meticulous preparation, quiet observation, and the occasional adjustment of a fiber knot to account for an unexpected shift in wind. By the end of the voyage, the navigator and crew arrived at their destination largely unremarked upon, except by those who cared deeply about subtlety and precision. Not all voyages were as smooth. Some involved minor navigational errors that extended travel by days or required slight detours. One navigator, in particular, misread a seasonal star and ended up near an island that offered less food than anticipated. The crew adjusted calmly, paddled a bit longer, and eventually corrected the course. There were no dramatic speeches, just gentle calculations, quiet murmurs about the stars, and the occasional sigh of resignation. Even food management became a silent art during these expeditions. Crew members and apprentices ensured that provisions lasted the voyage without panic. Water was rationed subtly, dried foods distributed with methodical care, and meals prepared in a way that didn't interrupt the rhythm of observation and paddling. A minor miscalculation in rations might result in a quiet reshuffling of meals, a kind of culinary negotiation conducted in whispers and nods. Apprentices observed these details carefully, internalizing the quiet discipline of life at sea. They learned that patience, subtlety, and calm observation were as important as reading stars or adjusting knots. A navigator's skill wasn't just in celestial knowledge but in maintaining the gentle rhythm of life on a canoe, ensuring that the crew, the vessel, and the journey itself moved in unhurried harmony. Some apprentices developed personal rituals to reinforce learning. One would tap each knot thrice while tracing it, believing that the repetition strengthened the connection to the stars. Another quietly hummed a low note while observing ocean currents, claiming it helped internalize subtle shifts. These practices were harmless, and they rarely affected the success of the voyage. In fact, many masters considered them quietly beneficial, a way of ensuring focus and reinforcing patterns over long stretches of calm, empty ocean. Stories of minor personal quirks are abundant. One navigator was known for adjusting knots only after sunrise, claiming that the fibers were drowsy at night and refused to align properly. Another reportedly spent hours lying on the canoe deck, eyes closed, fingers tracing fibers to feel the conversation of the waves. Crew members tolerated these habits because nothing about them caused harm and they produced reliable results. The apprenticeship process also included learning to cope with boredom, because long stretches at sea were inherently monotonous. The repetition of tracing knots, scanning the horizon, observing stars, and feeling currents could lull a person into a slow, meditative trance. Apprentices often remarked that time seemed to pass differently during these stretches, hours blending into days, days into weeks, all under the watchful but indifferent stars. Occasionally, minor tragedies occurred, though rarely dramatic. A mistied knot could result in a small detour, or a misread star could extend a voyage by a few extra paddling hours. These events were handled quietly, with calm adjustment rather than panic. In some cases, navigators would record these errors in memory or in subtle alterations to future grids, ensuring that the same mistake wouldn't recur. It was learning through experience, without the need for overt dramatics. The apprentice's growth was often gradual, marked by small milestones. Being able to trace a fiber without error, correctly predicting a star's rise, or noticing subtle shifts in currents all counted as progress. Success was internal, quietly acknowledged, and rarely celebrated. One apprentice, after months of training, quietly adjusted a grid during a voyage without prompting, eliciting a nod of approval from his master, a small, unspoken acknowledgement of competence. Apprentices also learned patience with the environment itself. The ocean and sky were indifferent to human schedules or expectations. Winds could lag, currents could shift, stars could rise a few minutes early or late. Navigators and apprentices accepted these variations calmly, making adjustments as necessary without dramatizing the imperfections. The skill lay not in forcing the ocean or stars to comply but in gently adapting to their patterns. Over time, apprentices internalized not just technical skills but a broader philosophy. Patience, observation, and subtle adjustment were key to navigating both the ocean and life itself. Long voyages reinforced a sense of quiet endurance, a rhythm of observation and minor correction that was both practical and deeply calming. By the end of training, apprentices could operate independently, tracing knots, reading stars, and anticipating environmental shifts with a calm efficiency that seemed almost meditative. Some voyages also included cultural instruction. Masters would share stories embedded in the knots, ancestral journeys, significant islands, or legendary crossings. These stories weren't dramatic. They were quiet transmissions of history, knowledge, and experience, gently reinforcing the apprentice's sense of continuity with the generations that had come before. The knots themselves became tactile memory aids, linking the apprentice physically and mentally to both past and present knowledge. Even small islands played their roles. Stopping at an island wasn't a dramatic event. It was a quiet, functional part of the voyage. Water, food, and rest were obtained with care, the canoe maintained meticulously, and the stars observed for subtle variations. The process was methodical, unhurried, and deeply embedded in the rhythm of the journey. The legends of certain long-distance voyages emphasize this calm precision. One navigator reportedly crossed hundreds of miles, correcting minor misalignments in knots and fibers with gentle murmurs, until the canoe arrived near its destination with little fanfare. Crew members noted the journey in quiet reports, apprentices absorbed the lessons, and the navigator returned home, likely tired but satisfied, without dramatic celebration or self-congratulation. Life at sea was punctuated by minor personal habits and rituals. One navigator insisted on arranging fibers in a particular pattern before nightfall. Another hummed a gentle tune while observing currents. Some apprentices preferred tracing knots while lying on their stomachs, others seated upright. None of these habits altered the fundamental principles of navigation. They were subtle personal adaptations, quietly integrated into the broader system. Chapter 5. Advanced Techniques and the Quiet Genius of Navigators. As apprentices matured into full navigators, they began to develop an intuitive understanding of advanced techniques. The coconut fiber grids were no longer just physical guides. They became extensions of memory and perception, tools to integrate multiple environmental factors into one cohesive, silent system. By this stage, a skilled navigator could make small adjustments to knots and fibers on the fly, subtly compensating for changing winds, currents, or even the occasional clouded sky. One technique involved layering grids. A navigator might use a primary grid for basic star positions and a secondary, smaller set of fibers for subtle seasonal corrections. The two grids worked in concert, allowing predictions of slight shifts in star altitudes or minor ocean variations. To an outsider, it might look like someone quietly fiddling with strings. To the navigator, it was a sophisticated dance of observation, memory, and tactile feedback, conducted in absolute silence, with the occasional muttered commentary about a lazy or uncooperative star. Seasons were essential to planning these adjustments. Navigators memorized patterns of seasonal stars, the angles of moonlight on the water, and the effects of prevailing winds. For instance, a navigator preparing for a voyage during the wet season would account for squalls and gusts, subtly adjusting fiber tension and knot spacing to maintain accuracy. These modifications were invisible to the untrained eye but critical for ensuring the canoe stayed on course. Currents demanded equally quiet attention. Experienced navigators could detect shifts in water movement by touch alone, feeling subtle changes along the hull or outrigger. One documented navigator reportedly ran a hand along the side of the canoe for hours, silently comparing tactile sensations to the knots in the grid, making adjustments that no one else even noticed. Crew members accepted this calmly, understanding that nothing about the ocean responded to impatience or panic. Even star behavior could be unpredictable. Some stars were constant and reliable, others exhibited subtle anomalies that required a navigator to adjust knots, fibers, or even timing of observations. One master navigator described a star that liked to rise late for apprentices, prompting the quiet correction of fiber tension, accompanied by a slow, resigned sigh. Observing and adapting to these minor celestial quirks became an essential skill, quietly passed down from master to apprentice over generations. Long voyages revealed the meditative rhythm of navigation. Days and nights blended into one continuous cycle of observation, adjustment, and minor manual tasks. Crew members paddled or maintained the canoe, apprentices traced knots and monitored environmental cues, and the navigator orchestrated it all with minimal intervention. The ocean and stars set the tempo, and everyone aboard adapted their personal habits to maintain harmony. Sleep was, naturally, intermittent. Navigators often rested during calmer periods, but kept hands lightly on the grids to detect deviations in star positions or fiber tension. Apprentices took turns on watch, observing the horizon or monitoring ocean currents while their master rested. This system allowed continuous observation without stress or drama, reinforcing the gentle rhythm that defined these voyages. Food management continued to be methodical. Provisions were distributed according to pre-planned schedules. Freshwater was rationed with quiet care, and dried food was portioned precisely to ensure the voyage could continue without disruption. Minor miscalculations were handled with calm adjustment rather than urgency. A slightly overestimated meal might be quietly postponed, or rationing adjusted for the remainder of the journey. It was practical, unspectacular, and effective. Some navigators exhibited eccentric habits at this stage of expertise. One would tie knots while softly humming a monotone tune, claiming that vibrations helped align the fibers with the stars. Another traced knots with closed eyes, fingers reading subtle variations in tension to detect environmental shifts. Crew members rarely commented. They had long accepted that minor eccentricities were part of the navigator's method, and that these habits often contributed to overall success. Advanced navigators also began experimenting with multiple methods of observation. Celestial observation was combined with natural indicators, bird flight patterns, wave movement, and even cloud formations. These observations were integrated into the fiber grids, creating a multilayered system that captured both predictable celestial phenomena and the subtle variability of the ocean environment. Apprentices learned to reconcile these multiple inputs calmly, tracing knots and adjusting fibers to maintain course. Minor personal crises still occurred, though rarely dramatic. A misread star could extend a voyage by a few days, requiring the crew to adjust paddling schedules or rationing. The navigator's response was always measured, involving minor adjustments to knots and fibers, quiet discussion with apprentices, and slow recalibration of expectations. These incidents were treated as learning opportunities, quietly reinforcing the importance of patience, observation, and adaptability. Legendary voyages often centered on the skillful integration of these techniques. One navigator crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean using layered grids, seasonal star observations, and tactile feedback from the hull to maintain course. Crew members and apprentices observed in calm silence, occasionally making minor adjustments as instructed. The voyage was successful, not because of dramatic intervention or heroism, but because every participant adhered to the gentle rhythm established by the navigator. Even mundane tasks contributed to the success of the voyage. Paddle placement, tool arrangement, and mat positioning were all managed with quiet precision. Nothing was left to chance. Misplaced implements were corrected with minor adjustments, spills handled silently, and errors incorporated into a continuous cycle of calm observation and methodical correction. Over time, apprentices internalized this discipline, learning that small, thoughtful actions were more effective than dramatic gestures. Cultural continuity remained central. Knots and fibers carried ancestral knowledge, marking successful crossings, cautionary tales, and significant islands. Apprentices learned these patterns slowly, often over years, internalizing both practical guidance and subtle historical narratives. Each voyage became not just a journey across the ocean, but a quiet engagement with centuries of knowledge, silently connecting past and present. Islands, too, played a subtle role. Stopping to gather food or water was always methodical, with careful attention to timing and environmental conditions. Beach approaches were calculated, reefs navigated with tactile feedback and fiber adjustments. These tasks were quiet, deliberate, and consistent, reinforcing the rhythm of observation and adaptation that defined life aboard the canoe. Advanced apprentices eventually developed independent judgment. They could trace knots, read stars, and anticipate minor shifts without constant supervision. They learned to integrate tactile feedback, visual observation, and natural cues, creating a subtle, multi-layered mental map of both the ocean and the sky. This independence was achieved slowly, through repetition, observation, and patient guidance rather than dramatic instruction. Even small errors were instructive. A mistied knot or misread star became a minor recalibration, quietly incorporated into future adjustments. Apprentices learned to accept imperfection as part of the system, calmly adjusting course and continuing the voyage. This quiet resilience was as important as any technical skill, reinforcing the philosophy of patient, deliberate action. Seasonal preparation remained essential. Before each voyage, navigators assessed star positions, wind patterns, and ocean currents. Coconut fiber grids were adjusted to match expected conditions, and minor rituals, tracing knots, humming tunes, or observing subtle environmental cues, reinforced both technical and psychological preparedness. Crew members participated silently, maintaining the calm rhythm of preparation and observation. Over time, the cumulative experience of multiple voyages created a subtle, almost imperceptible mastery. Navigators could anticipate minor deviations, adjust knots preemptively, and maintain course with minimal effort. Crew members and apprentices absorbed this rhythm, internalizing the quiet discipline and gentle efficiency that defined successful Pacific navigation. Even the quietest voyages contained lessons. A misaligned star or a sudden current could serve as a reminder of the ocean's subtle influence, reinforcing patience, observation, and adaptability. Apprentices absorbed these lessons gradually, integrating experience, memory, and tactile skill into a continuous system of gentle, methodical navigation. By the end of training, an apprentice could operate independently, tracing fibers, reading stars, and subtly adjusting course in response to environmental cues. The journey was never dramatic. There were no heroic rescues or loud proclamations. Instead, success was measured quietly. A steady course, a well-maintained canoe, and the subtle satisfaction of a voyage conducted in harmony with the ocean and sky. Even the final return to home islands was understated. Canoes arrived quietly, Crew members disembarked methodically, and navigators adjusted fibers and knots one last time. Stories were shared, not with excitement, but with gentle reflection. Lessons learned on the voyage were passed down, subtly shaping the next generation of navigators. The genius of these early Maori navigators lies in this quiet mastery, integration of tactile grids, memorized knowledge, seasonal observation, and patient, deliberate adjustment. There was no need for drama. The system worked because it was consistent, adaptive, and deeply attuned to both the ocean and the stars. Apprentices emerged skilled, thoughtful, and calm, prepared to carry knowledge forward with quiet precision. Chapter 6: Cultural Transmission and the Enduring Legacy of Navigators. As apprentices became navigators, the focus subtly shifted from personal skill to cultural continuity. Each voyage was not just a journey across the ocean, it was a living thread connecting generations. The coconut fiber grids, the subtle observations of currents, the memorization of seasonal stars, and the gentle rituals of tracing knots all functioned as both technical tools and vessels of inherited knowledge. Every motion, every fiber, carried centuries of quiet experience. Transmission of this knowledge was patient and methodical. Masters rarely gave lengthy lectures or dramatic demonstrations. Instead, they guided apprentices through repetition, observation, and gentle correction. A knot that was slightly off might be retied 3 times, with a quiet murmur about precision. A misread star would be noted, traced again, and integrated into a subtle mental framework. Apprentices internalized these lessons slowly through careful attention and repetition, without fanfare or emphasis. Some navigators were particularly meticulous about preserving ancestral techniques. One, named Pyri, reportedly refused to alter knots or fibers in any fundamental way, believing that ancestral knowledge had been refined over centuries and should not be tinkered with unnecessarily. Minor innovations were tolerated, but only when absolutely necessary to account for changes in currents, winds, or seasonal shifts. Apprentices under Pyri's guidance learned not only precision but respect for the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. Cultural context was inseparable from practical knowledge. Each island, reef, and landmark had associated stories, quiet narratives of migration, survival, and adaptation. Navigators and apprentices learned these stories alongside technical skills, tracing them in knots, murmuring them softly, and internalizing them as both cautionary and instructive guidance. Even mundane details, like a slight variation in reef formation or a seasonal change in bird patterns, were woven into these narratives, linking practical observation with cultural memory. Seasons dictated much of the rhythm of life at sea. Navigators memorized the rising and setting of stars, variations in moonlight, and prevailing winds, adjusting their grids accordingly. A particular star might signal the optimal departure for a distant island. A change in current or swell might require minor adjustments in fiber tension. These subtleties were never dramatic. They were quiet, constant, and essential. Apprentices learned to accept them as part of the rhythm of existence at sea. Observation extended beyond stars and currents. Birds, clouds, and even the behavior of fish informed navigation. A flock of terns might indicate nearby land, while a sudden gathering of seabirds could suggest a current shift or feeding pattern. Navigators interpreted these cues with calm attention, adjusting grids and course imperceptibly. Apprentices absorbed these observations silently, gradually integrating them into a nuanced, tactile understanding of the environment. Even the process of mapping islands and landmarks relied on subtle techniques. Canoes approached beaches slowly, noting reef formations, shallow areas, and landing points. Water sources were located and assessed for quality. Food resources were observed and, when necessary, harvested. All of these actions were conducted methodically, without fanfare, and quietly recorded in memory or reflected in knots and fibers. The knowledge accumulated from these careful observations formed an oral and tactile atlas, transmitted across generations without written language. Legends of exceptional navigators often emphasize patience over heroics. One renowned navigator reportedly crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean without error, using nothing but coconut fiber grids, memorized star positions and environmental cues. Crew members observed quietly, apprentices traced knots silently, and the canoe maintained a steady, unhurried pace. The success of the voyage was not celebrated with ceremony. Instead, it became a quiet benchmark, a demonstration of calm, precise skill, and patient mastery. Mistakes, when they occurred, were minor but instructive. Misread stars, small deviations in knots, or slightly misjudged currents led to minor detours, extended paddling, or adjusted rationing. These were never disasters. They were gentle lessons in patience and careful observation. Apprentices learned to accept imperfection as part of the process, integrating corrections into future grids and subtly adjusting techniques over time. The tactile nature of the coconut fiber grids cannot be overstated. Knots and fibers served as memory aids, teaching tools, and personal extensions of the navigator's perception. A slight tension in a knot could indicate a change in star position or current. A particular weave might mark the rising of a seasonal star. Apprentices learned to read these fibers with fingers, translating subtle variations into actionable guidance. The grid was both technical instrument and cultural artifact, quietly bridging knowledge and practice. Personal quirks continued to shape navigation. Some navigators hummed monotone tunes while tracing knots, believing vibrations enhanced accuracy. Others preferred specific fibers or knotting techniques, claiming minor improvements in consistency or readability. Crew members tolerated these eccentricities calmly, understanding that each idiosyncrasy was woven into the rhythm of the voyage, often contributing to its subtle success. Life at sea demanded patience in every aspect. Paddling, food preparation, and observation all required unhurried attention. Minor inconveniences, misaligned knots, slightly late stars, unexpected currents, were handled quietly and methodically. Crew members and apprentices learned that calm, persistent adjustment was far more effective than dramatic response. Over time, this cultivated not just navigational skill but a philosophy of measured, thoughtful engagement with the world. Cultural transmission was also reinforced by storytelling. Oral histories of past voyages, ancestral crossings, and subtle failures were shared alongside technical instruction. These narratives were never dramatic. They were gentle, reflective, and quietly instructive. Apprentices absorbed lessons not just from direct observation but from the accumulated wisdom of countless predecessors, internalizing both the practical and philosophical dimensions of navigation. Even brief stops at islands were integrated into this system. Food and water were obtained methodically. Canoes were maintained. Observations were quietly noted. Knots were adjusted to account for environmental variations. These stops reinforced the rhythm of the voyage, allowing both navigators and apprentices to integrate practical experience with reflection and preparation for continued travel. Advanced apprentices developed independent judgment. They learned to reconcile multiple inputs, stars, currents, birds, waves, into subtle, adaptive decisions. Minor environmental shifts were addressed proactively through tactile adjustments in the grid. The goal was never speed or heroism but harmony, the smooth, unbroken progress of the canoe across vast distances. Success was internal, subtle, and deeply satisfying. Even the smallest details mattered. Paddle placement, mat arrangement, and tool organization were all conducted with quiet precision. Misplaced items were corrected with minimal disruption, spills handled methodically, and minor errors integrated into continuous adjustments. Apprentices internalized these habits, learning that attention to detail and patient correction were as critical as star knowledge or fiber tension. Legends of extraordinary voyages emphasize quiet genius. One navigator reportedly crossed the open ocean hundreds of miles distant from land, correcting minor deviations in real time, adjusting knots and fibers with calm precision, and arriving at the intended island with minimal disturbance. The crew, apprentices, and even the ocean itself moved in a measured rhythm, demonstrating that skill and patience outweighed drama or speed. Cumulative experience created subtle mastery. Experienced navigators could anticipate minor environmental changes, adjust fibers preemptively, and maintain course effortlessly. Apprentices absorbed these rhythms over years, gradually internalizing observation, tactile feedback, and pattern recognition. Knowledge was transmitted not through spectacle but through quiet repetition, calm correction, and subtle reflection. Seasonal preparation remained a cornerstone. Before each voyage, grids were adjusted for expected star positions and currents. Minor rituals, tracing knots, humming, observing environmental cues, reinforced both technical skill and psychological readiness. Crew members participated silently, maintaining the steady rhythm of preparation, observation, and adaptation that defined life at sea. Even small errors were instructive. A misaligned star, slightly loose fiber, or unnoticed current deviation prompted calm adjustment, subtle recalibration, and continued observation. Apprentices learned resilience, patience, and meticulous attention to detail, absorbing lessons that would guide them through years of future voyages. By the end of training, apprentices became navigators, capable of independent operation. They traced knots, read stars, and anticipated subtle shifts in currents and winds. Voyages were completed without drama or spectacle, relying on gentle precision, patient adaptation, and a deep understanding of the interconnected rhythms of ocean, sky, and human skill. The enduring legacy of these early Māori navigators lies in this quiet mastery, integration of tactile grids, memorized celestial and environmental knowledge, patient observation, and methodical adaptation. There was no need for heroics. The system worked because it was consistent, subtle, and deeply attuned to both the ocean and the stars. Generations of navigators emerged skilled, thoughtful, and calm, prepared to carry knowledge forward with quiet precision, maintaining a tradition that connected the past, present, and future with gentle, unhurried continuity. Chapter 7: Ingenuity, Minor Mishaps, and the Meditative Rhythm of the Sea. Even the most skilled navigators occasionally encountered small challenges, though nothing that demanded drama. Minor errors in reading stars, slightly misaligned knots, or subtle shifts in currents were all part of the journey. These events were treated not as crises but as quiet puzzles, gently corrected through patient observation, adjustment, and, when necessary, a soft mutter about the indifference of the universe. For instance, one master navigator reportedly misread a star by less than a finger width on the horizon, resulting in a slight detour that added a few extra hours of paddling. Crew members did not panic, apprentices did not fret, and the navigator did not raise his voice. Instead, he quietly adjusted fibers on the coconut grid, corrected the canoe's heading, and resumed paddling. By nightfall, the minor error had been fully accounted for, without fanfare or dramatic acknowledgement. Ingenuity was often subtle. Navigators developed small techniques to refine accuracy, such as layering grids or marking fibers with slight variations in tension to account for expected environmental shifts. Some would make minor tactile cues on fibers to indicate seasonal anomalies or temporary cloud cover that could obscure stars. These adjustments were neither flashy nor ceremonious. They were practical, precise, and silently effective, allowing a voyage to proceed smoothly over hundreds of miles. Apprentices observed these small innovations attentively, internalizing subtle cues about problem-solving, calm adaptation, and continuous learning. Mistakes were treated as lessons rather than failures. A misread current might lead to recalibrated fibers or minor course correction. A slightly late star could result in gentle adjustment of observation times. Each incident reinforced the rhythm of patience and observation that defined successful navigation. Birds continued to play a role in navigation, often subtly. Certain species indicated proximity to land, while others suggested changes in currents or winds. Crew members and apprentices learned to read these natural cues alongside the coconut fiber grids. The combination of tactile feedback, visual observation, and environmental intuition became a quiet but powerful system, enabling precise navigation without external instruments. The canoe itself was central to this meditative rhythm. Its movement across the waves created tactile feedback that navigators could read with hands and fingers. Subtle variations in hull pressure, outrigger resistance, or wave flow informed adjustments to knots and fiber tension. Over time, apprentices learned to perceive these sensations with increasing subtlety, integrating tactile knowledge with observation of stars, currents, and winds. Even minor personal quirks influenced navigation. One navigator hummed softly while tracing knots, claiming that vibrations helped align fibers with the stars. Another preferred tying knots at specific times of day, noting that fibers respond differently in moonlight than in sunlight. Crew members tolerated these eccentricities calmly because, as with so many subtle habits at sea, they rarely caused problems and occasionally improved accuracy. Long periods of calm ocean travel created a meditative rhythm. Hours would pass with the steady sound of paddles, the gentle lapping of waves, and the soft murmur of tracing knots. Apprentices developed deep familiarity with this rhythm, often entering near-hypnotic states as they observed stars, adjusted fibers, and monitored subtle environmental changes. The repetition of tasks and the quiet attention required cultivated patience, focus, and a profound sense of continuity with the natural world. Minor mishaps sometimes created quiet learning opportunities. A misread star could extend the voyage by hours, prompting careful recalibration. A slightly loose knot might shift fiber alignment, requiring subtle correction. Each error reinforced the value of calm observation, methodical adjustment, and careful reflection. Apprentices gradually learned that the ocean and sky did not punish mistakes dramatically. They simply required attentive, patient adaptation. Navigators also learned to integrate subtle environmental anomalies into the rhythm of travel. Unexpected wind gusts, minor current deviations, or temporary cloud cover were addressed through adjustments in fiber tension, knot placement, or observation timing. These interventions were precise, quiet, and often almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet they maintained the smooth progress of the canoe. Legends of long-distance voyages emphasize the quiet genius of this approach. One voyage reportedly crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean with no dramatic intervention, just continuous observation, fiber adjustment, and minor course corrections. Crew members maintained the rhythm of paddling, apprentices traced knots silently, and the navigator orchestrated subtle adjustments with calm precision. Success was measured not in heroics but in continuous, gentle effectiveness. Even mundane tasks reinforced the meditative rhythm. Paddle placement, tool organization, and sleeping arrangements were managed methodically. A mislaid implement was quietly corrected. A spilled drink required calm attention and minor adjustment. Over time, apprentices absorbed the philosophy that attentive, deliberate action, no matter how small, was integral to successful navigation. Seasonal preparation remained a cornerstone. Grids were adjusted for star positions, currents, and wind patterns. Minor rituals, like tracing knots at dawn or humming quietly while observing the horizon, reinforced both technical skill and psychological readiness. Crew members participated without urgency, maintaining a calm, methodical tempo that defined every aspect of life aboard the canoe. Even minor errors in provisioning were handled with quiet resourcefulness. Slightly miscalculated rations were redistributed methodically. Water shortages prompted careful adjustment in usage. Crew members and apprentices observed and corrected calmly, integrating these practical lessons into the broader rhythm of voyage life. Over time, apprentices developed independent judgment, learning to integrate tactile, visual, and environmental inputs into subtle decisions. Misaligned knots, late stars, or shifts in currents were addressed with calm, proactive adjustment. Voyages became exercises in patient observation and methodical adaptation, with every participant contributing to the smooth progress of the canoe. Small islands provided additional lessons. Approaches to beaches required careful observation of reef formations and shallow areas. Water sources and food resources were noted with subtle attention to detail. Adjustments to fibers and knots accounted for environmental variations, creating a quiet system of observation, reflection, and correction that reinforced both technical skill and cultural memory. Cultural transmission remained central. Stories of past voyages, ancestral crossings, and minor errors were shared quietly alongside practical instruction. Apprentices absorbed these narratives as gently as they traced knots or observed stars. Each story, each fiber adjustment, linked technical knowledge with historical continuity, ensuring that lessons of patience, observation, and calm adaptation passed seamlessly from one generation to the next. Advanced apprentices eventually achieved near independence. They could trace fibers with precision, read stars and environmental cues, and adjust course subtly in real time. The canoe moved steadily, crew members maintained rhythm, and the navigator oversaw with minimal intervention. Voyages proceeded without fanfare, relying on calm skill, quiet ingenuity, and continuous, gentle adaptation. Even the smallest details mattered. Mat placement, paddle alignment, and tool organization were all conducted with meticulous care. Minor errors were corrected quietly, reinforcing a philosophy of attentive, deliberate action. Apprentices internalized this discipline, understanding that every subtle adjustment contributed to long-term success. Legends emphasize the quiet skill and ingenuity of these navigators. Crossing vast distances without modern instruments required precise observation, careful planning, and methodical adjustment. Minor errors were absorbed, corrected, and integrated into future practice. The rhythm of the sea, stars, and canoe created a meditative environment in which skill, patience, and subtle ingenuity were quietly cultivated and passed down. Experience created subtle mastery. Navigators anticipated minor shifts, adjusted fibers preemptively, and maintained course with calm efficiency. Apprentices absorbed this rhythm, gradually internalizing observation, tactile skill, and environmental awareness. Knowledge was transmitted not through spectacle or heroics, but through repetition, reflection, and quiet guidance. Seasonal preparation, careful observation, and methodical correction remained central. Grids were adjusted, minor rituals practiced, and every action integrated into the gentle rhythm of the voyage. Even small errors became teaching moments, reinforcing patience, attention, and subtle adaptation. Apprentices emerged skilled, thoughtful, and calm, prepared to maintain the continuity of navigational knowledge across generations. Chapter 8: Mastery, Personal Quirks, and the Subtle Poetry of the Sea. By the time an apprentice became a full navigator, mastery was less about raw skill and more about subtle intuition. The ocean, the stars, and even the canoe itself became extensions of the navigator's awareness. A gentle touch on the fiber grid could translate into a corrected heading. A slight change in outrigger pressure indicated a shift in current. Even the quiet flight of seabirds could inform decisions without a single word being spoken. Personal quirks persisted among masters, though they had become refined, almost meditative habits. One navigator reportedly traced knots with a finger while humming a soft monotone, claiming that the fibers respond to sound. Crew members tolerated this quietly. It neither improved nor harmed navigation in any overt way, but it did create a rhythm. Another preferred arranging fibers in a very specific order, noting that alignment at dawn ensures the stars are in a cooperative mood. These minor eccentricities contributed to a cadence, a slow, gentle order that permeated the voyage. Voyages became exercises in subtle poetry. Hours passed almost imperceptibly, punctuated only by the sound of paddles on water, occasional quiet murmurs about stars, and the soft swish of waves against the canoe. Apprentices often noted later that time seemed to dissolve into a seamless continuum, each movement flowing naturally into the next. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden threats, just the gentle cadence of practice, observation, and quiet skill. Errors, when they occurred, were almost philosophical in nature. A misread star might add a few extra paddling hours. A slightly misaligned knot could prompt a minor adjustment in heading. Crew members and apprentices learned that mistakes were not punishable events. They were gentle reminders of the ocean's subtle influence, teaching patience, careful observation, and thoughtful correction. Even food and provisioning followed this slow rhythm. Meals were distributed methodically, water rations adjusted quietly, and small miscalculations corrected without fuss. Minor disruptions, like a spilled drink or a slightly uneven ration, were handled with calm precision, teaching apprentices that small attentions to detail mattered as much as skillful observation of stars. Birds continued to provide gentle guidance. A lone seabird on the horizon could indicate proximity to land. A sudden gathering of fish-eating birds might signal a shift in current. These observations were subtle and quiet, absorbed without urgency. Apprentices learned to integrate these cues alongside their tactile and visual observations, creating a rich, multilayered system of navigation that functioned without fanfare. Cultural transmission remained at the heart of the practice. Each fiber, each knot, carried ancestral knowledge, linking contemporary navigators with generations past. Stories of voyages, subtle miscalculations, and seasonal shifts were transmitted orally, often in the gentle cadence of instruction or quiet reflection. These narratives were integrated seamlessly with technical practice, creating a living, tactile archive of wisdom. Seasonal preparation continued to guide voyages. Grids were adjusted for predictable shifts in star positions, expected wind patterns, and seasonal currents. Minor rituals, tracing knots at specific times, humming quietly, or observing environmental cues, reinforced both technical precision and psychological readiness. The rhythm of preparation mirrored the rhythm of travel, gently establishing harmony between navigator, crew, and environment. Long voyages emphasized patience over heroics. Hundreds of miles could pass without a single dramatic event. Minor errors, slightly late stars, small miscalculations, temporary cloud cover, were handled calmly through subtle adjustments in fiber tension, observation timing, or course correction. Apprentices learned to absorb these incidents with quiet acceptance, internalizing patience and methodical adaptation as core components of mastery. Even minor personal eccentricities contributed to success. A navigator's preference for tracing fibers at dawn, humming monotone tunes, or adjusting knots 3 times before committing to a course correction became part of the voyage's rhythm. These habits were tolerated, quietly observed, and sometimes adopted by apprentices, blending individual quirks into collective methodical practice. Canoe maintenance itself became meditative. Tools were arranged methodically. Mats, paddles, and provisions were positioned with quiet precision. Minor errors were corrected without dramatic intervention. Over time, apprentices internalized this attention to detail, learning that small, deliberate actions ensured long-term success. Every movement was purposeful, integrated seamlessly into the rhythm of travel. The tactile feedback of coconut fiber grids remained central. Knots and fibers encoded knowledge of stars, currents, winds, and seasonal shifts. Subtle variations in tension or weave allowed navigators to correct minor deviations without the need for verbal instruction. Apprentices gradually developed an intuitive feel for these grids, enabling adjustments almost automatically. The process was quiet, precise, and deeply absorbing. Even brief island stops were incorporated into the meditative cadence. Water and food were obtained methodically, the canoe maintained, and environmental observations quietly recorded in memory or reflected in subtle fiber adjustments. These pauses reinforced the rhythm of the voyage, integrating reflection, preparation, and minor course corrections into a seamless practice of attentive, deliberate engagement with the world. Advanced apprentices developed independent judgment. They could integrate multiple sources of information, stars, currents, winds, birds, clouds, into precise, subtle adjustments. Minor errors were anticipated and corrected preemptively. Success was not dramatic. It was measured in the smooth movement of the canoe, the calm rhythm of paddling, and the quiet satisfaction of maintaining course without disruption. Stories of particularly skilled navigators emphasize quiet ingenuity. One reputedly crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean with minimal intervention, adjusting knots, fibers, and course subtly in real time. Crew members maintained rhythm without urgency, apprentices traced knots silently, and the voyage concluded without fanfare. These tales were preserved not for their drama but for their demonstration of patient skill, subtle observation, and gentle mastery. Even environmental anomalies were handled with calm precision. Shifts in currents, temporary cloud cover, or minor variations in star positions were absorbed, subtle adjustments made, and the voyage continued without drama. Apprentices learned that these variations were not obstacles but integral parts of the system, requiring patience, observation, and methodical correction. Seasonal preparation, careful observation, and ritualized fiber adjustments remained constant. Grids were modified, minor habits practiced, and every action integrated into the rhythm of the voyage. Minor errors became teaching moments, reinforcing patient adaptation and careful attention to detail. The system's enduring effectiveness depended on subtlety, repetition, and calm responsiveness. By the end of training, a navigator could operate independently, tracing knots, observing stars, anticipating environmental shifts, and adjusting course subtly. Voyages proceeded smoothly, without dramatic events or heroic intervention. Success was quiet, internal, and cumulative, a demonstration of the gentle integration of tactile skill, environmental awareness, and cultural knowledge. The enduring legacy of early Maori navigators lies in this quiet mastery, precise tactile observation, patient adaptation, cultural continuity, and a meditative rhythm of practice. Generations of navigators emerged skilled, thoughtful, and calm, carrying centuries of knowledge forward. The tradition persisted not through spectacle or drama, but through meticulous, deliberate, and patient action, maintaining harmony between human skill, the ocean, and the stars. Chapter 9: Philosophical Reflections and Lessons from the Ocean. Long voyages gave navigators more than technical skill. They also offered quiet philosophical insights. The rhythm of paddling, the tracing of coconut fiber grids, and the subtle observation of stars and currents cultivated a contemplative mindset. Mistakes were absorbed calmly, environmental shifts were noted without drama, and the slow passage of time fostered patience, introspection, and an appreciation for subtlety. One commonly observed lesson was the value of imperfection. Stars never rose at exactly the same time, currents shifted slightly from expectations, and wind patterns occasionally defied prediction. Navigators learned to accommodate these inconsistencies through small, careful adjustments rather than frustration or dramatic intervention. Apprentices observed this closely, understanding that mastery meant responding to the world as it is, rather than as they wished it to be. Personal quirks continued to flourish, shaping both the rhythm of the voyage and the apprentice's learning. A navigator might tie knots only after sunrise, citing the morning alignment of fibers, or hum gently while observing the horizon to encourage cooperation from the stars. Crew members tolerated these habits quietly. Apprentices gradually absorbed them, recognizing that small, idiosyncratic routines contributed to the larger system of precision and calm observation. Observation extended beyond stars, currents, and waves. Birds, clouds, and subtle changes in watercolor provided additional cues for navigation. A solitary turn might indicate the approach of land. A darkening cloud bank could suggest a shift in wind direction. These cues were always incorporated silently, assessed carefully, and used to refine the tactile and visual guidance of the fiber grids. Apprentices learned to integrate these inputs patiently, creating a multi-layered understanding of the ocean environment. Even errors were instructive. A misaligned knot or slightly late star could extend a voyage by a few hours. Crew members adjusted calmly, apprentices learned, and the navigator quietly corrected the grid. These minor disruptions reinforced a philosophy of patience, methodical adjustment, and acceptance of the ocean's subtle unpredictability. Nothing was treated as catastrophic. Everything was an opportunity for quiet learning. The meditative rhythm of the voyage was enhanced by repetition. Hours passed under a sky streaked with constellations, punctuated only by gentle paddling, soft murmurs, and the tactile engagement with fibers. Apprentices often reported a sense of timelessness, a feeling that minutes and hours blended seamlessly into one continuous, gentle flow. The monotony was deceptive. It cultivated observation, precision, and a deep internalization of navigational skill. Even provisioning followed this slow, careful cadence. Meals were distributed methodically, water rations monitored, and any miscalculations quietly corrected. Minor disruptions were treated with calm adjustment. Apprentices learned that careful attention to small details mattered as much as star observation or fiber alignment. The philosophy of attentive, deliberate action extended to every aspect of life at sea. Cultural continuity remains central to this philosophy. Each knot, each fiber, carried ancestral knowledge. Oral histories of past voyages, successful crossings, and minor errors were shared alongside practical instruction. These stories were absorbed silently by apprentices, linking technical skill with cultural and historical understanding. Knowledge was transmitted gently, without fanfare, ensuring that lessons persisted across generations. Seasonal preparation was equally integral. Navigators adjusted grids for expected star positions, wind patterns, and currents. Minor rituals, tracing knots at specific times, humming quietly, or observing environmental cues, reinforced both technical precision and psychological readiness. Crew members participated silently, maintaining the calm rhythm of preparation and observation. Even minor environmental anomalies were handled with quiet ingenuity. Shifts in currents, temporary cloud cover, or slightly misaligned stars were accounted for through tactile adjustments, subtle timing shifts, or minor course corrections. Apprentices learned that the ocean demanded attentive, calm responsiveness rather than dramatic intervention. The meditative quality of navigation was reinforced by personal habits. Quiet humming, tracing knots with fingers, or adjusting fibers according to perceived rhythms of the ocean became subtle methods for maintaining focus. Crew members accepted these eccentricities as part of the rhythm, and apprentices often adopted them, integrating individual quirks into collective practice. Mistakes continued to serve as gentle lessons. A misread star, a loosely tied fiber, or a slight misjudgment in current required minor adjustments. These events were not dramatized. They were quietly integrated into ongoing observations, reinforcing patience, careful attention, and subtle correction. Apprentices absorbed these lessons gradually, internalizing the philosophy that minor imperfections were part of the process, not failures. Long stretches at sea provided opportunities for reflection. Navigators and apprentices developed awareness of subtle patterns in the ocean, sky, and wind. They learned to anticipate small deviations, recognize minor anomalies, and integrate these observations into a continuous system of adjustment. The canoe became an extension of perception, the fiber grids an interface with environmental rhythms, and every movement an expression of thoughtful adaptation. Even brief stops at islands reinforced this contemplative approach. Food and water were collected with care, observations quietly noted, and minor adjustments to knots and fibers made as necessary. These pauses allowed reflection, preparation for continued travel, and integration of subtle environmental insights. Every action contributed to the slow, meditative cadence that characterized life at sea. Apprentices eventually developed independent judgment, learning to reconcile multiple inputs, stars, currents, birds, clouds, into precise, subtle adjustments. Minor environmental changes were anticipated, deviations corrected, and the voyage continued with quiet efficiency. Success was measured not in heroic deeds but in the smooth, continuous progress of the canoe across vast distances. The poetic quality of navigation emerged from this integration. Every action, paddle stroke, knot adjustment, observation of a star, was part of a larger rhythm. Mistakes, minor shifts, and environmental anomalies became gentle reminders of the ocean's subtle influence. Apprentices learned to embrace this rhythm, cultivating patience, attentiveness, and reflective calm. Even environmental unpredictability was incorporated into the philosophy of practice. Sudden gusts, shifting currents, or unexpected cloud cover were met with minor adjustments and calm observation. Navigators emphasized methodical response over dramatic reaction, teaching apprentices that adaptability and quiet attentiveness were central to mastery. The meditative cadence extended to all aspects of voyage life. Paddle placement, mat arrangement, and tool organization were conducted with meticulous care. Minor errors were corrected without urgency, reinforcing the philosophy of deliberate, attentive action. Apprentices absorbed this rhythm, understanding that success depended on subtle, continuous practice rather than spectacle or heroics. Seasonal and environmental preparation remained foundational. Grids were modified for expected star positions, wind patterns, and currents. Minor rituals, tracing knots, humming softly, observing subtle environmental changes, reinforced technical and psychological readiness. The rhythm of preparation mirrored the rhythm of travel, maintaining harmony between navigator, crew, and environment. Even minor miscalculations in provisioning were instructive. Water rations, slightly uneven meals, or minor missteps in resource allocation required calm adjustment. Apprentices learned to integrate these practical corrections into the broader rhythm of the voyage, reinforcing attentive, deliberate, and patient action. By the end of their training, apprentices achieved quiet mastery. They could trace knots, observe stars, anticipate subtle environmental changes, and adjust course seamlessly. Voyages proceeded smoothly, without dramatic interventions, relying on calm skill, subtle ingenuity, and patient observation. The tradition endured through generations because it emphasized consistent, gentle, and deliberate mastery over spectacle or speed. Chapter 10. Legacy, Reflection, and the Quiet Wisdom of Navigators. As the generations of Māori navigators continued their work, their skill became not only a technical accomplishment but also a quiet, enduring philosophy. The lessons learned at sea were more than patterns in stars or fiber grids. They were meditations on patience, observation, and the subtle rhythms of the natural world. Apprentices who matured into navigators carried forward knowledge that had been refined over centuries, preserving it through careful practice, gentle correction, and the steady, almost hypnotic repetition of methodical observation. Success in navigation was never flashy. There were no dramatic rescues or triumphant arrivals. Instead, it manifested in subtle ways. The smooth motion of the canoe across open water, the quiet alignment of the stars and fibers, and the calm satisfaction of a voyage completed without error. Crew members and apprentices understood that mastery was defined by continuity rather than spectacle. Every adjustment of fiber, every correction of heading, and every observation of the environment contributed to a rhythm that, over time, became second nature. Even the quirks of individual navigators were absorbed into the broader system. One might hum while tracing knots. Another might pause at dawn to observe the alignment of stars with fibers. These idiosyncrasies, far from being distractions, often enhanced the meditative quality of travel. Apprentices, over time, adapted to these habits, internalizing their effects on rhythm and accuracy. The human element, personal, quiet, and deliberate, was as essential as the technical knowledge encoded in the coconut fiber grids. Environmental observation remained central to the navigator's craft. Birds, waves, clouds, and water coloration provided subtle cues about nearby land, current shifts, or wind patterns. Integrating these with tactile feedback from the canoe and the fibers, navigators developed an almost imperceptible sense of harmony with the environment. Mistakes were handled quietly, adjustments made without fuss, and every subtle shift became a teaching moment for apprentices. The cultural dimension of navigation was equally important. Stories of voyages, minor errors, and ancestral crossings were shared alongside technical instruction, preserving not only knowledge but the philosophy underpinning it. Apprentices internalized these narratives as part of their own development, learning to balance precision with patience, skill with reflection, and observation with intuition. The journey across the ocean became both a practical exercise and a living engagement with centuries of collective wisdom. Long voyages emphasized the meditative rhythm of life at sea. Hours of paddling were punctuated only by the quiet tracing of knots and subtle adjustments to the fiber grids. Time seemed to pass almost imperceptibly, reinforcing patience and focus. Apprentices reported that the repetition and continuity of tasks led to a heightened awareness of patterns in the environment and a profound sense of connection with the natural world. Even minor challenges contributed to learning. A slightly late star, a misaligned knot, or a subtle current shift prompted calm correction and reflection. These incidents reinforced the philosophy that mastery involved continuous adaptation, careful observation, and patient response. Errors were never dramatic. They were gently integrated into the ongoing rhythm of the voyage, teaching resilience and measured judgment. Provisioning and logistics also followed this slow, deliberate pattern. Meals were distributed methodically, water rations monitored, and minor miscalculations quietly corrected. Apprentices learned that attention to detail in everyday tasks was as essential as accuracy in star observation or fiber alignment. The philosophy of careful, deliberate action permeated every aspect of life at sea. The tactile feedback of the coconut fiber grids remained a cornerstone of mastery. Knots and fibers encoded knowledge of stars, currents, and seasonal shifts, translating subtle observations into actionable adjustments. Apprentices developed an almost intuitive understanding of these grids, enabling precise corrections without spoken instructions. The fiber system was both practical instrument and repository of cultural memory, linking generations of navigators through tactile, hands-on knowledge. Even brief stops at islands reinforced the rhythm of travel and learning. Water and food were collected with methodical attention, environmental observations quietly noted, and knots and fibers subtly adjusted as needed. These pauses allowed reflection, minor correction, and integration of observations into the ongoing practice of navigation. Every action, however small, became part of the meditative cadence that defined life at sea. Advanced apprentices achieved independent judgment through continuous observation, tactile feedback, and careful integration of multiple environmental cues. Minor errors were anticipated and corrected before they became significant. Voyages proceeded with quiet efficiency, reflecting a philosophy in which attention, patience, and subtle adjustment were paramount. Mastery was not measured by dramatic feats, but by the smooth, continuous movement of the canoe and the absence of preventable mistakes. Personal quirks, far from being distractions, were quietly incorporated into this rhythm. Humming, tracing knots at specific times, and particular preferences in fiber alignment all contributed to consistency and mental focus. Crew members tolerated these habits, and apprentices gradually absorbed them into their own practice. The combination of personal rhythm and technical skill created a subtle, continuous system of excellence. The poetic quality of navigation emerged naturally from these practices. Every paddle stroke, every fiber adjustment, and every star observation was part of a larger rhythm. Minor errors, environmental shifts, and unpredictable patterns were absorbed and corrected gently, reinforcing patience, attentiveness, and calm reflection. Apprentices learned to appreciate the subtle beauty of the system, understanding that harmony arose not from control, but from responsive, careful integration with the natural world. Even environmental unpredictability was instructive. Shifts in currents, gusts of wind, and temporary cloud cover required subtle, calm adjustments. Navigators emphasized thoughtful response over urgency, teaching apprentices that adaptability and quiet observation were essential. Mastery emerged through careful attention to small details, integrated over long distances and extended periods at sea. Seasonal and environmental preparation reinforced this philosophy. Grids were adjusted for anticipated star positions, wind patterns, and currents. Minor rituals, tracing knots, humming softly, observing subtle cues, reinforced both technical and psychological readiness. The rhythm of preparation mirrored the rhythm of travel, establishing harmony between navigator, crew, and environment. Even minor miscalculations in provisioning became lessons. Water rationing, uneven meal distribution, or small logistical errors prompted calm adjustment. Apprentices internalized these practices, recognizing that attentive, deliberate action in all aspects of voyage life contributed to overall success. Mastery was as much about mindset and procedure as it was about reading stars or knots. By the conclusion of training, apprentices became fully capable navigators, tracing fibers, observing stars, and adjusting course with subtle precision. Voyages proceeded without drama, relying on continuous observation, patient adjustment, and harmonious engagement with the environment. Generations of navigators maintained the tradition, passing knowledge forward through quiet, deliberate practice. The enduring legacy of early Maori navigators rests on this philosophy: precise tactile observation, patient adaptation, integration of cultural knowledge, and meditative engagement with the environment. Their skill endured not because of spectacle or heroics, but because of meticulous practice, subtle ingenuity, and thoughtful responsiveness. Each generation preserved the rhythm of life at sea, creating a continuous, living tradition of quiet mastery. Ultimately, the canoe, the fiber grids, and the stars became extensions of human perception, teaching patience, subtlety, and reflection. Every small adjustment, every observed pattern, and every careful correction reinforced a philosophy of attentive, deliberate engagement. The wisdom of these navigators persisted quietly, carried forward by apprentices and masters who understood that harmony and skill emerged not from urgency or heroism but from calm, continuous, and thoughtful practice. Chapter 11: Exceptional Voyages and the Flow of Life at Sea. Even among skilled navigators, some voyages earned quiet renown, not for dramatic feats, but for their seamless precision and meditative flow. These were journeys where the stars, currents, birds, and fibers all seemed to align perfectly, a demonstration of years of careful observation and subtle mastery. Crew members often remarked later that time passed differently during these trips, the rhythm of paddling, tracing knots, and observing the environment merging into a kind of slow-motion continuity. Apprentices accompanying these journeys were particularly attentive. Every adjustment of fiber tension, every minor recalibration of knots, and every observation of a star or current was absorbed carefully. These trips were as much about demonstrating philosophy and rhythm as they were about navigation. Mistakes were rare, but when they occurred, they were treated calmly and used as lessons in patient correction rather than sources of stress or blame. Some navigators had signature habits that became integral to the flow of their voyages. One reportedly preferred tying knots only while sitting cross-legged at the stern, claiming the motion aligned the fibers with the waves. Another hummed softly during twilight observations, believing that vibrations helped synchronize the crew with the environment. Apprentices observed these eccentricities without judgment, gradually learning how personal rhythm could complement technical precision. The meditative rhythm of long voyages was reinforced by repetitive, consistent tasks. Hours of paddling alternated with careful observation of stars, clouds, and currents. Each adjustment of a fiber, each minor course correction, was a moment of quiet reflection. Apprentices often described a sense of timelessness, where minutes and hours merged into an almost hypnotic awareness of the ocean's subtle rhythms. Even minor environmental anomalies were instructive. A slightly shifted current, a cloud briefly obscuring a star, or an unexpected bird formation required careful, calm adaptation. Crew members and apprentices absorbed these occurrences as natural components of the voyage. Errors were gently corrected, integrated into ongoing observations, and rarely caused any disruption to the steady rhythm of travel. Provisioning and daily routines followed the same philosophy. Water and food were carefully rationed, minor miscalculations were quietly corrected, and tasks like mat arrangement or paddle placement were completed with meticulous attention. Apprentices learned that careful attention to detail in mundane activities was just as important as mastery of navigation. Every movement contributed to the smooth, continuous flow of the voyage. Even seemingly trivial details, like the alignment of fibers or the spacing of knots, carried subtle meaning. A knot tied too loosely might result in minor deviation from a star's course. A slight tension adjustment could correct small errors in heading. Apprentices developed an almost unconscious feel for these adjustments, translating tactile feedback into navigational decisions with increasing precision. Birds remained silent guides. A lone seabird on the horizon could hint at nearby land. A flock in the distance might suggest a current shift or feeding pattern. Navigators integrated these cues seamlessly with observations of stars, water, and waves. Apprentices learned to perceive these signals subtly, understanding that success depended not only on technical skill but on continuous, attentive observation of the environment. Seasonal preparation reinforced the rhythm of voyages. Grids were adjusted for predicted star positions, expected currents, and wind patterns. Minor rituals, like tracing knots at dawn or observing subtle environmental changes, contributed to both technical and psychological readiness. Crew members and apprentices participated quietly, maintaining the smooth cadence of preparation that mirrored the rhythm of the ocean itself. Even minor errors became teaching moments. A slightly misread star, a knot tied too loosely, or a minor misjudgment in current prompted calm adjustments. Crew members followed procedures without panic, and apprentices observed the corrections, internalizing lessons in patience, attention, and methodical adaptation. The philosophy was consistent. Mistakes were part of learning, not opportunities for dramatic intervention. Advanced apprentices gradually developed independent judgment. They integrated multiple cues, stars, winds, currents, clouds, birds, into subtle decisions. Small errors were anticipated and corrected proactively. Voyages proceeded quietly, efficiently, and without unnecessary fuss. Success was measured not in dramatic heroics, but in continuous, smooth, and precise progress across open ocean. The tactile aspect of navigation remained central. Coconut fiber grids encoded subtle knowledge about seasonal star shifts, currents, and winds. Fingers traced knots, reading subtle variations in tension and weave, translating tactile feedback into real-time navigational adjustments. Apprentices gradually developed intuitive understanding, allowing them to anticipate minor changes and respond calmly without verbal guidance. Even brief stops at islands reinforced lessons in observation and careful adjustment. Water sources, food availability, and landing conditions were noted systematically. Knots and fibers were subtly altered to account for local environmental factors. These pauses allowed reflection, preparation for continued travel, and integration of insights into ongoing practice. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to the meditative cadence of life at sea. Personal habits continued to shape the flow of voyages. Some navigators preferred tracing knots only under specific lighting conditions, while others adjusted fibers according to the perceived alignment of stars with the horizon. Crew members and apprentices observed these practices with quiet acceptance. Over time, eccentricities were often absorbed into the broader rhythm, demonstrating that personal rituals could enhance both focus and precision. Even the slow, repetitive motion of paddling contributed to meditative focus. Crew members maintained a steady rhythm, apprentices traced knots or observed subtle environmental changes, and navigators adjusted course imperceptibly. The combination of repetition, observation, and quiet adjustment created a state in which navigators, crew, and apprentices were attuned to the ocean's subtle rhythms. Mistakes remained opportunities for reflection rather than sources of drama. A minor deviation in course, a misaligned knot, or a late star observation was integrated into continuous adjustment. Crew members and apprentices absorbed these corrections calmly, reinforcing the philosophy that mastery is built through patient observation and careful adaptation rather than urgency or spectacle. Seasonal preparation continued to reinforce the meditative and practical aspects of navigation. Grids were updated to reflect star positions, expected currents, and anticipated wind patterns. Minor rituals, like tracing knots at certain times or observing environmental cues, ensured that technical readiness was paired with psychological calm. The rhythm of preparation became an extension of the rhythm of travel itself. Even minor logistical errors were instructive. Water rationing, uneven meal distribution, or misplacement of tools were addressed methodically and calmly. Apprentices internalized these practices, learning that attentive, deliberate action in all aspects of life at sea was critical to long-term success. Mastery encompassed both technical skill and the careful management of practical, everyday tasks. By the end of apprenticeship, navigators achieved seamless integration of skill, observation, and personal rhythm. Knots were traced with precision, stars observed with subtle attention, and minor adjustments made instinctively. Voyages proceeded smoothly, without drama, relying on continuous attention, calm adaptation, and quiet mastery. Generations of navigators preserved these methods, creating a living tradition of subtle, enduring skill. The enduring legacy of these exceptional voyages is quiet but profound. Mastery emerged from patient observation, tactile skill, and cultural continuity. Personal quirks and habits enhanced focus and rhythm rather than detracting from precision. Mistakes were integrated into ongoing observation, teaching resilience and methodical adaptation. Success was not dramatic, it was cumulative, subtle, and internal. The ocean itself became a teacher. Currents, stars, winds, and clouds offered guidance through continuous observation and gentle adjustment. Apprentices learned to read these subtle cues, translating tactile, visual, and auditory information into precise, calm action. The philosophy of navigation emphasized harmony, patience, and reflection, principles that extended far beyond the practicalities of travel. Chapter 12: Intergenerational Knowledge, Subtle Deviations, and Quiet Triumph. The most remarkable aspect of early Maori navigation was not any single voyage, nor any dramatic crossing of vast oceans. It was the continuity of knowledge passed down through generations, carefully preserved, adapted, and refined. Apprentices who became navigators carried forward techniques, subtleties, and philosophies honed over centuries, ensuring that even the smallest deviations, errors, or peculiar habits contributed to a legacy of quiet mastery. Even minor deviations on a voyage became learning opportunities. A misread star, a knot tied too loosely, or a slight misjudgment in current was treated methodically. Crew members calmly adjusted, apprentices observed, and navigators made precise corrections. These deviations were never considered catastrophic. They were quietly absorbed into the rhythm of the voyage and internalized as lessons in patience and subtle adaptation. The handover of knowledge from master to apprentice was as deliberate as the voyages themselves. Fiber techniques were traced and observed carefully. Star positions were memorized, environmental cues noted, and personal quirks explained. Apprentices learned not only the mechanics of navigation but also the philosophy underpinning it. That skill was inseparable from patience, attentiveness, and the quiet observation of patterns in nature. Personal quirks remained central to the rhythm of travel. Some navigators preferred tracing knots under the first light of dawn, while others hummed quietly to encourage the fibers to cooperate. Crew members and apprentices accepted these idiosyncrasies because they enhanced focus and established a consistent cadence. Over time, eccentric habits were internalized as part of the broader system of precise, calm navigation. Environmental observation continued to be integrated seamlessly into daily practice. Birds, clouds, wind patterns, and subtle changes in wave behavior provided nuanced cues about land, currents, or potential weather shifts. Apprentices learned to perceive these indicators quietly, integrating them alongside tactile and visual feedback from the fiber grids. Even the smallest observation could influence a course adjustment, demonstrating the cumulative importance of continuous attentiveness. Even small errors reinforced the philosophy of patience and methodical adaptation. A slightly misaligned knot could nudge a course off by mere fractions of a degree, prompting careful recalibration. A cloud obscuring a star for a few minutes required calm improvisation. Apprentices gradually internalized that success was built not on flawless prediction, but on consistent, quiet correction and awareness of subtle environmental signals. The rhythm of life at sea reinforced meditative focus. Long hours of paddling, tracing fibers, and observing stars created a continuous, almost hypnotic state. Crew members maintained steady cadence, apprentices observed and adjusted, and navigators monitored the overall system with quiet precision. Over time, this repetition cultivated deep understanding, patience, and reflective calm. Provisioning and daily tasks followed the same slow, deliberate pattern. Water rations were monitored, meals distributed methodically, and tools arranged carefully. Minor miscalculations were quietly corrected. Apprentices absorbed these habits, understanding that attentive action in even the most mundane tasks contributed to the seamless operation of the voyage. Mastery was holistic, encompassing both technical skill and disciplined management of everyday details. Cultural continuity remained central. Oral histories of previous voyages, ancestral crossings, and minor deviations were shared alongside technical instruction. Apprentices internalized these narratives as part of their practice, linking skill with philosophy and experience. Knowledge was preserved not through spectacle or urgency, but through deliberate observation, repetition, and quiet reflection. Seasonal preparation reinforced the subtle integration of skill and environment. Grids were adjusted for anticipated star positions, currents, and wind patterns. Minor rituals, tracing knots at specific times, observing clouds or bird behavior, or humming softly, ensured technical and psychological readiness. These habits reinforced the meditative rhythm of navigation, embedding subtle continuity across voyages and generations. Advanced apprentices developed independent judgment through continuous observation and tactile feedback. Minor errors were anticipated and corrected before they could significantly affect course. The canoe moved steadily, crew members maintained rhythm, and apprentices learned to respond calmly and effectively to subtle deviations. Success was defined not by dramatic rescue or heroic action, but by the smooth, continuous progress of the canoe. Even personal eccentricities became instructional tools. Humming, dawn-specific fiber adjustments, and precise knot spacing all contributed to the rhythm of travel. Apprentices gradually adopted or adapted these habits, demonstrating that individual quirks could enhance collective precision. The philosophy of navigation emphasized harmony, patient observation, and subtle responsiveness rather than urgency or spectacle. The poetic quality of the practice became evident over time. Every paddle stroke, every fiber adjustment, and every star observation was part of a seamless flow. Minor errors, environmental shifts, and unpredictable patterns were gently absorbed and corrected, reinforcing patience, attentiveness, and methodical adaptation. Apprentices learned that mastery was not only technical but philosophical, an integration of skill, observation, and reflective calm. Even the slow, repetitive motion of paddling contributed to meditative focus. Crew members maintained consistent rhythm, apprentices traced fibers or observed subtle environmental cues, and navigators adjusted course with imperceptible precision. This continuous flow cultivated a state of calm, attentive awareness that underpinned both technical mastery and philosophical reflection. Errors continued to provide quiet lessons. A slightly misread star, a knot tied too loosely, or a minor deviation in current was corrected methodically. Crew members followed procedures without urgency, apprentices observed and internalized the lessons, and the navigator made precise adjustments. Each incident reinforced the philosophy that patient observation and subtle adaptation were central to successful navigation. Seasonal preparation remained foundational. Grids were modified to account for star positions, expected currents, and anticipated wind patterns. Minor rituals ensured readiness and reinforced the meditative rhythm of practice. Crew members participated calmly, maintaining continuity of technique and observation while embedding lessons from previous voyages. Even logistical challenges were absorbed into the rhythm. Water rationing, uneven meal distribution, or minor misplacement of tools prompted quiet adjustments. Apprentices learned to integrate these corrections into their ongoing practice, reinforcing the principle that attention to detail in every aspect of life at sea was critical to long-term mastery. By the conclusion of training, apprentices had achieved quiet, seamless mastery. Knots were traced with precision, stars observed attentively, and subtle adjustments made instinctively. Voyages proceeded smoothly, relying on continuous observation, patient correction, and careful integration of environmental cues. Knowledge was preserved across generations, maintaining the rhythm and philosophy of navigation without need for spectacle or dramatic heroics. The enduring legacy of early Maori navigators rested on this philosophy: meticulous observation, patient adaptation, tactile mastery, and intergenerational continuity. Personal quirks and habits enhanced rhythm and precision rather than detracting from them. Minor errors were integrated into practice, cultivating resilience and methodical skill. Success was cumulative, subtle, and internal, measured not in dramatic feats but in the harmonious, meditative flow of the canoe across open ocean. Chapter 13: Rare Anecdotes and the Meditative Lessons of Voyages. Even within the otherwise gentle and predictable rhythm of Maori navigation, a few voyages stood out, quietly remarkable, not for dramatic heroics, but for subtle moments that revealed the skill, patience, and meditative attention of the crew. These stories often circulated among apprentices as examples of ingenuity, calm adaptation, and the delicate integration of environmental observation with fibergrid mastery. One voyage, for example, involved a long crossing where cloud cover obscured most of the stars for several nights. Crew members maintained steady paddling, apprentices traced knots with quiet focus, and the navigator adjusted fibers incrementally in response to subtle tidal and current cues. The voyage concluded successfully, with the canoe arriving precisely where the navigator had intended. Later, apprentices described it as a lesson in patience and trust in subtle cues, a story repeated gently to emphasize calm observation over urgency. Another instance involved unexpected changes in currents near an unfamiliar coastline. Birds indicated shifts in the water that were otherwise imperceptible, and the navigator quietly shifted the fiber alignment, adjusting heading fractionally over the course of hours. Crew members and apprentices followed these subtle cues without comment, their actions blending into the rhythm of paddling and observation. Upon reaching land, the navigator explained that the journey had been a delicate exercise in continuous attention to small, almost invisible environmental signals. Even eccentricities played a role in memorable voyages. One navigator hummed a monotone tune for the entirety of a crossing lasting multiple days, claiming it helped maintain consistency in fiber tension. Apprentices, initially skeptical, eventually noticed that the canoe's movement and rhythm were slightly more stable than on previous crossings. The story was passed down, not as superstition, but as a reminder that personal habit and meditative focus could enhance skill in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Long voyages allowed for quiet reflection, both on technical skill and philosophical understanding. Crew members and apprentices reported that time seemed to slow, that hours melted into each other with a steady cadence of paddling, fiber tracing, and observation. Environmental cues, wind patterns, currents, the flight of birds, the subtle variation of stars, were absorbed in a calm, contemplative rhythm. Mistakes, minor deviations, and natural variations were all integrated seamlessly into this flow, teaching resilience, patience, and attentive focus. Even routine provisioning took on a meditative quality. Meals were distributed methodically, water rationed carefully, and tools arranged in precise order. Minor errors were quietly corrected. Apprentices observed these actions as part of the broader philosophy. Careful attention to detail in daily life reinforced the subtle mastery required for navigation. The philosophy extended beyond stars and fibers into every aspect of the voyage. Cultural continuity persisted in these stories. Oral histories preserved lessons learned from minor deviations, unusual weather, and particularly smooth or challenging crossings. Apprentices were taught not only to replicate technical skills but also to absorb the philosophy underlying them. Knowledge was transmitted patiently through repetition, observation, and gentle instruction, ensuring that each generation integrated practical skill with reflective calm. Seasonal preparation reinforced both technical readiness and philosophical grounding. Grids were adjusted for anticipated star positions, expected currents, and wind patterns. Minor rituals, tracing knots at specific times, observing environmental signals, or engaging in personal meditative habits, reinforced the rhythm of preparation. Apprentices absorbed these practices quietly, internalizing the rhythm of the journey before setting out on their own. Errors, when they occurred, were never dramatized. A slightly misaligned knot, a minor misjudgment in current, or a cloud-obscured star prompted calm correction. Crew members adjusted quietly, apprentices learned, and the navigator's deliberate interventions ensured continuity. Over time, these minor corrections became integrated into the philosophy of practice, reinforcing that mastery was built through subtle, cumulative observation rather than sudden heroic action. Advanced apprentices eventually developed independent judgment, able to integrate multiple cues, stars, birds, currents, clouds, into smooth adjustments. Minor errors were anticipated and corrected before they could accumulate. Voyages continued quietly, efficiently, and without disruption, demonstrating that patient observation and subtle responsiveness were more effective than urgency or dramatic intervention. The tactile experience of the coconut fiber grids remains central to mastery. Knots encoded information about stars, currents, and seasonal shifts, translating visual and environmental observation into tactile cues. Apprentices learned to read these cues instinctively, making adjustments in real time with minimal verbal instruction. Over time, the fibers became an extension of perception, linking skill, observation, and cultural continuity in a seamless practice. Even short island stops reinforced lessons in careful observation and adjustment. Water and food were obtained systematically, minor environmental observations were recorded mentally or subtly reflected in fiber adjustments, and small maintenance tasks were completed meticulously. These pauses offered quiet reflection, integration of lessons, and reinforcement of the rhythm of attentive practice. Personal quirks and rituals continued to influence the rhythm of voyages. Some navigators adjusted fibers only under specific lighting conditions, while others preferred tracing knots at dawn. Crew members and apprentices observed these habits quietly, gradually incorporating them into the rhythm of their own practice. Such eccentricities, far from being distractions, often enhanced precision, focus, and the meditative flow of the journey. Even the repetitive motion of paddling contributed to reflective focus. Crew members maintained a steady rhythm, apprentices traced fibers or observed subtle environmental cues, and navigators adjusted course imperceptibly. This continuous flow fostered a heightened awareness of environmental patterns, cultivated patience, and reinforced a philosophy of attentive, deliberate engagement with the natural world. Minor mistakes continued to provide lessons. Slightly misread stars, loosely tied knots, or subtle current shifts were integrated into the ongoing rhythm of observation and adjustment. Crew members responded calmly, apprentices absorbed the corrections, and the navigator maintained course with quiet precision. Each incident reinforced the philosophy that subtle, attentive adaptation was central to mastery. Seasonal and environmental preparation remained foundational. Grids were modified for anticipated star positions, currents, and wind patterns. Ritualized tracing of knots, humming, and observation of environmental cues ensured technical readiness and reinforced meditative focus. These practices linked preparation with execution, ensuring that voyages were both effective and harmoniously attuned to the rhythm of the ocean. Even logistical tasks were integrated into the philosophy. Water rationing, meal distribution, and tool organization were completed with careful attention, and minor miscalculations were corrected calmly. Apprentices absorbed these practices as part of the broader philosophy. Attentive, deliberate action in every aspect of life at sea was essential to long-term mastery. By the end of their training, apprentices achieved seamless integration of skill, observation, and personal rhythm. They could trace knots, observe stars, anticipate subtle environmental changes, and adjust course instinctively. Voyages proceeded quietly, relying on continuous observation, subtle correction, and harmonious engagement with the natural world. Generations of navigators maintained the rhythm and philosophy of their ancestors, preserving continuity across centuries. The quiet legacy of these voyages rests on the cumulative effect of patient observation, subtle mastery, tactile skill, and cultural continuity. Personal eccentricities and minor deviations were integrated thoughtfully into practice, enhancing rhythm and precision. Mistakes were incorporated as learning moments, reinforcing patience, attentiveness, and subtle adaptation. Success was not measured by drama or spectacle, but by the smooth, meditative flow of the canoe across vast, open waters. Chapter 14: Closing Reflections and the Enduring Wisdom of the Sea. As we drift toward the final reflections on these centuries of quiet, meticulous navigation, it becomes clear that the significance of early Maori voyaging was never about drama or spectacle. The true achievement lay in continuity, subtle mastery, and the meditative rhythm cultivated over countless crossings. The canoe, the fiber grids, and the stars were more than tools. They were instruments for developing patience, attentiveness, and reflective engagement with the natural world. Apprentices who became navigators absorbed lessons at every moment. Every misaligned knot, every slightly delayed star observation, every shift in current was an opportunity for calm correction and subtle adaptation. Mistakes were never dramatized. They were integrated into the smooth, continuous flow of observation and adjustment. Over time, these small, deliberate corrections accumulated into expertise, demonstrating that mastery is built gradually without urgency or spectacle. Even personal quirks and eccentricities were woven seamlessly into the rhythm of life at sea. Some navigators hummed while tracing knots, others preferred specific lighting conditions or times of day for adjustments. Crew members accepted these habits quietly, and apprentices gradually incorporated them into their own practices. Eccentricities were recognized as extensions of meditative focus rather than distractions, enhancing both precision and reflective calm. Environmental observation remained at the center of every voyage. Birds, clouds, currents, and subtle variations in waves provided guidance that could not be replicated in any other way. Apprentices learned to perceive these cues with gentle attentiveness, integrating them alongside tactile and visual feedback from the fiber grids. Even the smallest observation, an unremarkable bird, a fleeting change in watercolor, could subtly influence navigation, reinforcing the philosophy that nothing was too minor to be noticed. Long periods of repetition, paddling, fiber tracing, and star observation created a meditative cadence. Apprentices often described a sense of timelessness, where hours merged seamlessly and attention became both sustained and gentle. Mistakes were naturally absorbed into this rhythm, reinforcing the practice of continuous observation, subtle adjustment, and quiet reflection. The voyage became an extended exercise in patience, focus, and subtle mastery. Provisioning, daily routines, and minor logistics were approached with the same careful attention. Meals were rationed methodically, water carefully measured, and tools arranged with precision. Minor errors were corrected calmly, and apprentices observed these practices as part of the holistic philosophy of attentive living at sea. Every action, no matter how mundane, contributed to the smooth, seamless progress of the voyage. The tactile experience of the fiber grids remained a cornerstone of skill. Each knot encoded environmental information, translating star positions, wind patterns, and seasonal changes into actionable adjustments. Apprentices learned to interpret these cues instinctively, developing a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of the ocean's rhythms. Fibers became extensions of perception, linking tactile mastery, observation, and reflective thought in a continuous cycle of attentive engagement. Even brief stops at islands reinforced this meditative rhythm. Water sources, food collection, and subtle environmental observations were incorporated methodically into practice. Minor maintenance of fibers and knots provided opportunities for reflection, reinforcing the quiet philosophy underpinning every voyage. Pauses were integrated into the journey as moments for attentive observation and subtle learning, rather than interruptions or delays. Advanced apprentices developed independent judgment, able to reconcile multiple environmental cues and subtle fiber adjustments without explicit instruction. Minor errors were anticipated and corrected with quiet precision, demonstrating that success relied not on drama or speed, but on patience, observation, and disciplined adaptation. The rhythm of the voyage was maintained, and the meditative quality of skill remained central to every crossing. Even the slow, repetitive motion of paddling contributed to the contemplative experience. Crew members maintained consistent rhythm, apprentices traced knots or observed birds and clouds, and navigators adjusted course imperceptibly. The continuous flow created heightened awareness of patterns in nature, reinforcing attentiveness, patience, and reflective calm. Time passed softly, almost imperceptibly, as the canoe moved steadily through open waters. Minor errors continued to offer subtle lessons. Slightly misread stars, loosely tied knots, or shifts in currents were integrated into ongoing observation and adjustment. Crew members responded calmly, apprentices absorbed lessons quietly, and navigators made corrections with precision. These small deviations reinforced the philosophy that attentive, deliberate adaptation was central to mastery. Seasonal preparation linked technical readiness with meditative practice. Grids were adjusted for predicted star positions, expected currents, and anticipated wind patterns. Ritualized tracing of knots, humming, and environmental observation reinforced both technical skill and psychological focus. Preparation mirrored the rhythm of travel, embedding continuity and calm attentiveness into every stage of a voyage. Even logistical tasks were approached thoughtfully. Water rationing, meal distribution, and tool organization were completed with care, and minor miscalculations corrected quietly. Apprentices internalized these practices as part of the holistic philosophy. Attentiveness and deliberate action in daily life were as essential as skill in navigation. Mastery encompassed both technical and practical aspects of life at sea. By the end of their training, apprentices achieved seamless integration of skill, observation, and personal rhythm. Knots were traced precisely, stars observed attentively, and subtle course adjustments executed instinctively. Voyages proceeded quietly, relying on continuous observation, subtle correction, and harmonious engagement with the natural world. Knowledge and philosophy were preserved across generations, maintaining,